Hello everyone, Thomas here from Medieval Review, and I wanted to talk about what your eyes should be doing in combat from a martial arts standpoint. What I really mean by this is, do your eyes, what you see, do they influence what you do when you're in a fight? And can they be used against you? I think the answer to this is essentially yes. But I really wanted to kind of go in depth on my thoughts on this, as well as kind of point to some historical examples and have a general conversation about how you judge what your opponent is doing in a fight. The reason that this really came up is that I've been playing For Honor. And I just finished a 3-hour live stream to wrap up the campaign in that game. And it has an interesting aspect to it that I can highlight for the purposes of this conversation. It has to deal with martial arts. And that is when someone is doing a really big attack, they're doing a huge thing where they're pulling the sword up over their head and they're just going to come down on you as hard as they can. It basically in the game, it prevents you from doing what's essentially rushing in and doing a little bit of a grapple move. And I find this a little bit strange because it really worked against me. Every time I saw an opponent in the game do that, I wanted to rush in. And part of my instinct for that, I think, really comes from my time doing HEMA, where many of the masters would actually very much teach you that as soon as someone comes up for a very large hit from above, and they are exposing themselves, it's a perfect time to rush in, to do a slice up the arms, or to do a grapple. And so I was kind of doing the wrong thing from a gameplay perspective, but in my opinion, from a martial arts perspective, I think it was the right thing. But your eyes teach you to look at things, and you learn how to interpret what an opponent is doing and interpret what is happening in front of you in very interesting and unique ways. There was a television show that came out a couple years ago now, probably quite a long time ago. It was on Netflix for a short period of time. It was called Brain Games. I'm not really here to talk about that show, but there was a very specific segment in it where they basically put a bunch of ping pong balls on an outfit that people were wearing. It's kind of like the motion tracking suits that people wear, and they had them do activities. And the idea was, can your brain interpret based on just these little points in space that roughly represent the human body? Can you interpret what's actually happening on screen? And what they were showing on screen was some people dribbling a basketball, and you could say, oh yeah, I can tell from that motion they're playing basketball. And they had some people dancing. You say, yes, they're dancing, they're doing a waltz, right? And then they had this one segment where it was people, and it was like in the television show, they were assuming it was going to be very hard for you to tell what the people are doing. They're like, this one's going to be a lot harder. Can you tell what's happening now? And I looked at it, and my very first instinct said, they're fighting with lightsabers. Now, I was technically wrong because, according to the show, they were sword fighting, but their sword fighting was stage combat. So I interpreted it as they're fighting with lightsabers. But the point is that when you spend time in martial arts, you can begin to develop kind of an instinct for what your opponent looks like and whether or not what they're doing is martially sound or if they have good form, just simply based on what they look like when they're in a stance and a guard or when they're coming at you and attacking you. And your eyes can tell you a lot about that, the information you can gain from it. And on kind of the same notion, when I was watching Star Wars Rebels with my wife, who really loves Star Wars and loves that cartoon, there was a recent episode. It was actually one that Matt Easton did a video on not too recently, or not too long ago. And it was them teaching one of the characters how to do lightsaber fighting. And Matt's video on this is pretty interesting because he's kind of making some points about how lightsabers are supposed to work. But what my thought on this was, I was watching it and I immediately looked at my wife and said, they're doing Japanese sword forms. This is influenced by the Japanese katana. And my wife said, well, yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's like a mix, because she knows all this stuff. It's a mix between Japanese sword forms and stage combat. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. And again, the concept is I could see on a cartoon, a CG animated cartoon, I could tell what the influence of the martial art was simply on what was being portrayed on screen. And so your eyes tell you a lot, right? Your eyes give you a ton of information. But they can also work against you. And that's actually one of the points I wanted to bring up here. I actually got some quotes here, and I want to just kind of work through it. Your eyes work against you a lot. And in HEMA, Historical European Martial Arts, we don't talk about this a ton because the sources don't really speak to it too much. But part of treating it like a martial art is you kind of, I've always likened it to the Jurassic Park thing of you have to insert some frog DNA to make the dinosaur. In order to make historical European martial arts work to some extent, you kind of have to draw from some other martial arts or martial arts backgrounds that people have in order to get the concept of the actual martial concept through sometimes. And so while there may not be a ton of sources in terms of like long sword fighting, the Fiores and the Lichtenauer traditions, there is some interesting information that does come from later sources that have to do with what your eyes tell you. One of the indicators we actually get in German treatise is the idea of the squint strike. There's actually kind of two interpretations for squint strike and kind of two meanings to squint strike. But one of those meanings is use your eyes to tell your opponent, I'm going to strike here, and then you kind of strike in a different space, a different opening. It's a way of tricking your opponent. So you're actually lying to your opponent with your eyes. And likewise, your opponent can do that to you if you're looking right at them, dead in their eyes. And that's kind of the point I wanted to bring up, is because realistically, from a martial arts standpoint, forgetting the historical European martial arts standpoint, but just martial arts in general, in my opinion, it's a terrible idea to be completely focused on any one thing. To back this up, I'm going to bring up Miyamoto Musashi, who is not normally someone I would quote, but known for being a great swordsman. And he made the statement that perception is strong, but sight is weak, and sight is weak, depending on how it's translated. And the concept here being that what you perceive is more important than what your eyes tell you. And this to kind of expand on this quote in a different piece of text. He said this: "Since olden days, many opinions have been expressed about which part of an opponent one should look at during a duel. But the majority of people have supported staring at an opponent's face. When so doing, the eyes should be narrower than usual, but the mind should be broad. The eyeballs should not move, and when the opponent is near, they should be focused as though they were looking into the distance. In this way, a man can look not only at his opponent's face, but his whole body, thus being able to anticipate any offensive thrust he might take. In my opinion, there are two kinds of eyes, one that simply looks at things, and the other that sees through things to perceive their inner nature. The former should not be tense, so as to observe as much as possible. The latter should be strong, so as to discern the working of the opponent's mind clearly. Sometimes a man can read another's mind with his eyes. In fencing, it is all right to allow your own eyes to express your will, but never let them reveal your mind. This matter should be considered carefully and studied diligently." The way I actually teach this in my HEMA class is I talk to people about don't focus on the blade. If someone's fighting you and here they are in Flug and they've got their pointer, they're coming at you and they're trying to get that point in your face. A lot of people, this is where they pay attention to. Right here at the point, they're like, oh my goodness. And as soon as you've done that, you've broken your concentration on the person as a whole. In theory, you should be able to, as Musashi says, you should be able to look through the person. You should be able to stare at a point in space and understand what attack is going to come at you simply based on their body language. From your peripheral vision, it should be sufficient. And you should be able to respond to that, because if you know what they're doing, if you can see what they're doing, you can respond accordingly. Their sword is really only going to come at you in a way that meets with the reality of how they're going to move. And what this comes down to, the way I teach this, I tell people, I want you to look dead ahead. I'm going to put two people kind of on either side of your peripheral vision, and I'm going to have them change guards. And I want you to call out what guards they're standing in, and I want you to appropriately match their guards as they change. So if this person over here is doing an ox guard, then I would call out, it's an ox guard, and then I would go to a guard that I thought would maybe counter ox, or something that would give me maybe a partial advantage, maybe set myself up for like a Krummfau or something. And the concept here being to train the person to not focus on just the tip of the sword or look at someone right in the eyes or pay attention to what their shoulder is doing. And we as humans do this a lot. We are very focused on looking very intently at something and not perceiving the whole. It's kind of a tunnel vision that happens. And it's important from a martial arts perspective to actually learn to be able to read the entire body. So it's kind of going back to that brain games idea or that Star Wars Rebels lightsaber learning episode, or even maybe to a lesser extent the For Honor example, but being able to gauge based on just the overall body language what a person is doing. It's really important. But at the same time, just as much as it's important to be able to perceive those things, what matters more is what you feel through the sword. There's been a lot of discussions about this online over the years. People have talked about, well, we know the idea of feeling, the feeling when someone is strong against your sword and they're up and you're weak. You can feel that. You can feel what's happening. And you can feel if they go weak. And you could close your eyes and just as easily comprehend and understand what's happening. To some extent, in 1891, Alfred Hutton, and I'm not a Hutton expert. Reach out to Matt Easton for that. But in the book The Swordsman, he talks about the concept of kind of a blindfolded lesson, where essentially they put their students in blindfolds and they force them to learn based on their feeling of the sword alone, maybe a stick in the case of a practice, what their opponent is going to do and how to respond correctly. This will result in many a time getting smacked in the hand or smacked in the head for doing the wrong thing, but the idea is that eventually you can learn exactly what your opponent's doing just through the feeling. And so at the end of the day, what your eyes do in a martial arts is many faceted. It's got a lot of different aspects to it. But as a martial artist, if you're seeking to become a very good one, and I say this as someone who probably is not nearly as good as I wish I was, but I think I'm gaining some ground in the martial arts perspective, to be able to understand the entirety of your opponent's body, be able to perceive what they're doing, maybe even before they know what they're doing, to use your eyes to your advantage to maybe tell them, hint to them that you're going to attack in one opening and then you attack in another. These are concepts that are really important to learn, but more importantly is to learn how to feel, how to use the sword as an extension of your body and have an understanding of, based on what you're feeling, what the reaction should be and how you should attack, or more importantly, maybe sometimes, how you should defend yourself. And so at the end of the day, this is just a ramble about, well, what do your eyes say in martial arts? And I hope I gave some perspective in it. I hope I wasn't too rambly, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because I've been thinking about this for quite a while and have just not done a video on it. And so I'm really interested to see what the community as large thinks. People who have been doing HEMA for a while, or really anyone from any martial arts background, tell me, has any of your instructors ever told you to pay attention to the whole body? I wonder this because I think that it's very often missed. And I think it's really important for the larger HEMA community especially, but certainly the martial arts community, to really begin to get people to focus on broadening their perspective and understanding how to perceive things. And of course, as Musashi says, perception is strong and sight is weak. Cheers, guys. See you next time. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out Medieval Review on Patreon.